Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you and our expert panelists to this UK and a Changing Europe Lunch Hour seminar on the state of the UK's labour market. My name is Catherine Barnard. I'm Professor of EU Law and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also Senior Fellow in UK and a Changing Europe. With me is Donald Houston, also a Senior Fellow in UK and a Changing Europe. He's Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Birmingham. And his project looks at the levelling up and the labour supply. With us also is Paul Sissons, Professor of Regional Economic Policy at the University of Keele, and his research looks at regional economic development and regional labour markets, which we'll come to shortly. And finally, Nicola Smith from the TUC. She's Head of Rights, International Social and Economics Department at the Trade Union Congress. And she will be able to comment helpfully on both the economic issues, but also the employment law issues which arise. I want to remind you that UK and a Changing Europe is going to be producing shortly a labour tracker, which perhaps Donald can say a word or two about. It's coming out in a couple of weeks. Also, a reminder to you, and I can see somebody's already engaged with us, that your questions should be put onto Slido, and I will pick those questions up and ask as many as possible. Now, the way we're going to structure this seminar is I will ask some questions. The panelists aren't going to make presentations as such. We hope it can be a reasonably interactive session, and obviously we'll allow enough time at the end for you to put, for me to ask the questions that you have kindly put on Slido. So I'll start with a nice simple question for you, Donald. Things going well on the labour market?
They have been better. The good news, I'll start with the good news. The good news is that the labour market over the last year or so has at least stabilised. We're not seeing rocketing job vacancies that we saw early in the pandemic and labour shortages. And economic inactivity, that's people who are not working or searching for work, which rose very sharply during the pandemic, has actually started to, well, it's stabilized and is even edging downwards now. So the good news is that at least the labour market has stabilized in terms of the pandemic shock, which was very acute. But we still face considerable challenges in the labour market, many of which were there before the pandemic and before Brexit, although the pandemic and Brexit may have made them slightly worse, particularly the pandemic. So before the pandemic, the UK's labour market was characterised, compared to our European and other OECD neighbours, as actually having relatively low levels of economic inactivity and low unemployment, which in some ways is good news. But that was in the context of very big rise in underemployment and other forms of labour market precariousness that really accelerated and rose since the global financial crisis. So we don't have the same problems in the UK labour market of mass long-term unemployment that we used to perhaps in the late 20th century. But that's been replaced by very high levels of underemployment. That's people wanting to work more hours than they're currently getting, which is part and parcel of quite a precarious bottom end of the labour market. So there's some issues there that I think Nicola will pick up later. The dominant story that we've had in the last 3 years, 3 or 4 years, 3 years since the pandemic, has been labour shortages, or at least hard to fill vacancies. There's a debate to be had there whether it's a labour shortage or the jobs aren't attractive enough. But that has been very acute since the pandemic. And the UK, compared to our European neighbours, has seen a much bigger fall in economic activity. So the size of the workforce shrunk more and has only very recently started to recover again since last year. And other European countries didn't have nearly such a deep or a long drop in the size of the workforce. And therefore didn't have as acute recruitment problems that the UK employers have faced over the last 2 or 3 years, 2 years in particular. So there was a lot of press about the so-called Great Retirement, and there was a spike in retirement, particularly as the pandemic or lockdown struck, which might have brought forward some people's decision to retire in the context of the tail end of the baby boomers moving into sort of normal retirement ages. And that all happened at the same time as Brexit, which saw the strong growth that we'd seen in the number of EU workers in the UK curtail. Didn't really drop, or drop sharply, but the growth suddenly stopped. So in terms of the size of the workforce, the UK had a bit of a perfect storm. We had this tail end of the baby boomers moving out with a smaller cohort behind them of core working age, people in their 40s and 50s over the last few years, at the same time as the pandemic bringing forward some people's retirement decision, and also the health impacts, which we'll talk more about later. So the UK is in the labour market's in quite a difficult place. Some of the problems around precarity of employment have been a long time in the making. I didn't, as a labour market researcher, I didn't see the big drop in labour supply during the pandemic coming. I imagined that we'd see a huge rise in unemployment. So I've been proved wrong on that, but it's quite the big drop in labour supply that we've had in the UK has been is somewhat more acute than other European countries, which is something we're still grappling with.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much for providing that by way of context. Paul, did you want to add to that and specifically look at the regional variations? Donald's given us a good global picture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess just to add to what Donald was saying about the sort of national picture. I mean, I think I would say the sort of the performance of the UK labour market in the last 18 months or so, I mean, there's actually been pretty good. I think all this is quite difficult because, in a sense, we've come out of a pandemic and it's quite hard to know what good looks like. So I guess we're sort of grappling with that. But I think some of the aspects of labour market performance in the last 18 months or so have been relatively strong. But I think in the most recent data, you can definitely see signs at the national level that the kind of recovery is starting to soften a little bit. So you see employment growth starting to flatten out, a sense that pay growth maybe has peaked, unemployment's creeping up, redundancies are creeping up, insolvencies are up as well. And self-employment's seen a fall as well, particularly into the construction sector. So I think there's a sense that we're maybe moving into a slightly different phase now after the sort of maybe a sort of mini post-pandemic boom in some respects in the labour market, albeit within the context of some of the longer term issues that Donald's already identified. So in terms of the regional and the local picture, I'll just pick up on some of the evidence coming out of some work that Donald and myself have been doing using job vacancy data to try and understand what's been going on at a local and regional level in terms of the labour market. And we can see some we can see some relatively distinct kind of geographical patterns here. I'll put this in the context of the kind of, we know there are important longer term issues around regional imbalances in the UK economy. London and the greater southeast versus everywhere else. So I'll put it within that kind of longer term context. But looking at what happened with vacancies during the pandemic and in the sort of period of the recovery, we can pick up on I think a relatively uneven picture in terms of what happened to total vacancies, but also some of the sort of sectoral patterns that kind of underpinned that. So generally, parts of the southeast and also some of the sort of rural areas tended to see slightly lower falls in vacancy rates during the pandemic, but also saw faster levels of increase in vacancies in the kind of post-pandemic, or at least the sort of post-lockdown period, where some of the large urban areas in parts of north of England tended to see bigger falls in vacancies and a slower recovery as we were sort of coming out of the pandemic. So I think we can see some differences there, and also potentially some evidence of some sort of suburbanisation of vacancies around London rather than necessarily concentrated in London itself. And I think there's some quite interesting sectoral patterns that underpin some of that. So the importance of professional jobs in driving that kind of vacancy recovery in parts of the London commuter belt, hospitality in other areas, and kind of logistics and warehousing vacancies driving those patterns kind of right across the board, and have been a really quite significant part of some of those very high vacancy rates that we've seen. Just to pick up, and I know we're going to talk about ill health shortly in terms of inactivity, because there's also been the geographical patterns around rising inactivity. We've seen quite different patterns in different parts of the country, and I know we're going to get into some of the detail, but I guess one of the things that I think comes through in that is that some of the rises in economic inactivity that we've seen in recent years has been in slightly different parts of the country than where we've seen it in response to previous economic shocks. And so whether that implies quite a different set of kind of drivers of that or not, I think is something that is still a kind of open question.
Thank you. That's really very helpful. Nicola, I wonder if I could ask you, Donald obviously talked about precarious work and a growth of underemployment. I imagine that's an issue that the TUC's got thoughts on.
Yes, absolutely. Of course it is. And good afternoon. Lovely to be here with everyone on this call. I think the first thing that I probably need to say is that the real issue that's been of concern for us over the last 18 months now is the scale of the falls in people's real wages across the economy. So while we've seen employment rates post-pandemic higher than we might have anticipated, I hear you, Donald, in anticipating rises in unemployment that didn't necessarily come to pass post-pandemic, but the rate at which inflation has been rising relative to people's earnings, and the nature of the jobs we've been creating and the pay rates and the hours that they offer people have meant that in terms of their real incomes, most people in the UK are now no better off than they were in 2008. And that is a historic fall in people's living standards from earnings of, proportions that would have been unimaginable decades ago. It's the longest sustained fall in people's living standards since Napoleonic times. And, I feel as if I was working at the TUC just at the back end of the last Labour government and during the financial crisis. And then I left this role and, I've done other things since, and now I've returned. And I'm struck by the fact that the concern we were pointing to in the early 2010s and 11s about the rates of real wage growth has never been addressed. Over the last decade, we've seen periods where wages have grown a little, there's been a bit of recovery, and then we've seen this enormous sustained real wage squeeze over the last 18 months. And the impact for living standards and for people's expectations of the standards of life that they can expect from work has been severe. So I think that's probably a really important piece of context that we need to put into the discussion. And we've also done analysis, obviously in recent weeks, those of you who follow the labour market data in detail will know in recent months rather, inflation is falling, the rates of nominal pay growth have looked improved, but that's an aggregate measure. And when you look across sectors, unsurprisingly, it's only in financial services that we find that real wages have staged a recovery back to where they were in 2008. In many other sectors, there's still a huge amount of ground to make up. And in some, including across the public sector, people's earnings are still falling in real terms. So that's the first thing I suppose it's important to reflect on. Secondly, what's happening with unemployment, underemployment? I think we're at a turning point, and I hope that I hope it doesn't become as bad as it looks as it could become, and I hope that growth recovers more rapidly. But we have been seeing sort of this gradual increase in unemployment for quite a few months now. There's questions we might come on to about the quality of some of the data, and I know we've got a lot of uncertainty at the moment about exactly what labour market trends we can point to with certainty, but it is clear that vacancies are falling, as Paul said, redundancies are rising, insolvencies are going up, and we hear from businesses that the high interest rate environment that we're in at the moment, with the overhang of debts from COVID, means that there's a lot more jobs potentially at risk now than may have been the case during previous recent periods. So I think if we can't secure a strengthening in GDP and some sort of improvement in our output, if we're still bumping along in this sort of overall economic picture of GDP shrinking one month and growing a small amount the month afterwards, there is quite some risk for where unemployment may go, because the rate at which it's rising at the moment is, if those data are to be believed, taking us beyond what the OBR and the Bank of England forecast for us to be, and taking us to higher rates quite rapidly than we might have seen in the most recent history. And I suppose the final thing to say is just this point about job quality, because again, in previous recent recessions in the UK, we have seen that in contrast to the very, very high levels of unemployment that we experienced in the 1980s, the jobs market has responded with higher rates of job loss and lower rates of job creation, but also with very high levels of insecure work and with underemployment, people with some work but not enough and less than they want. And I think that it may well be that the labour market responds in that way again. It may also be that we see higher rates of job loss. I can't make a prediction about that at the moment, but we know that across the decade, the levels of insecure work in the UK have increased very significantly, to the point where I think 1 in 9 workers, we say, are now on what we term an insecure job. And it's quite a tight definition. It's a definition that includes people on 0 hours contracts, agency, casual and seasonal workers. It doesn't include those on fixed term contracts, which some definitions do, and the very low paid self-employed who miss out on rights and protections that come from being an employee. And for some groups of workers, that's even higher. It's 1 in 6 for BME workers compared to 10% of white workers, for example. And in some parts of the economy, the rates are higher again. We know that I think it's like half of domiciliary care workers are on a 0 hours contract. So we've got a jobs market where for many people in some of the lowest wage work is also highly insecure in a way that doesn't allow people to plan their lives, to have the security of knowing they're going to be able to make ends meet at the end of the month. And that has to change from our perspective. It can't be a situation that we allow to continue, and it's not a situation that many of our European competitors allow their workforce to experience.
Thank you. That's obviously you're broadly singing from the same song sheet. While you're talking, Nicola, obviously the government has just passed the new act on giving those on precarious contracts the right to request more stable hours. Will that make a difference?
I don't think a right to request is what's needed in this area. You know, and a right to request nicely when you're in a precarious situation and your work can just be terminated by raising your head above the parapet isn't a right that we think there's any evidence is going to make a great deal of difference. The change that we would like to see would be a right for every worker to have a contract that reflects their regular hours and pay. So instead of the right to ask for it, a right to have it and an expectation that it is provided.
Thank you. You also mentioned questions about the data and the quality of data. And indeed, there is a question on Slido, and I remind everyone to do please put your questions on Slido. I'll try and weave them into my own questions. Is how reliable are labour market data given the LFS, the Labour Force Survey, response rates have dropped since the pandemic? Donald, do you want to tackle that question on the quality of data?
Yes, sure. This has been the cause of a lot of uncertainty, and is actually the reason that UK and Changing Europe decided to delay the release of the labour market tracker that we were originally hoping to do today. The data in it are broadly fine, but we want to take time to understand the data issues, which we've done. Yeah, this has been quite headline news over the last couple of weeks. On one level, it sounds technical and geeky on terms of data, but it's really quite important. So 2 weeks ago, well,
why is it? I mean, you're right, Donald. It does sound geeky, and yet Chris Giles managed to do a long piece in the FT last week. Why do we need to care?
Well, I mean, the figures on unemployment and economic inactivity and jobs growth are looked at every month by the or every quarter by the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. So it's something that's alongside many other things, of course, that feeds into their decision on interest rates. So it's something that affects everyone. So we need to have good information on the state of the labour market in terms of how much slack there is for more people to be able to come and fill jobs, because the Bank of England doesn't want labour shortages adding to wage pressures and feeding through to inflation pressures. So it makes a difference in an immediate sense. It makes a difference. The quality of labour market data affects base rate decisions that the Monetary Policy Committee are making. So it is very important from that point of view. And also, of course, a whole range of other organisations, including TUC, researchers, businesses, or business organisations are using labour market data for analysis to understand what's going on. So it is very important for those reasons. I mean, should I say, I can explain briefly, without getting too geeky, hopefully, about what has actually happened over the last couple of weeks, which
that would be helpful.
Which builds on problems that have been sort of brewing with the labour force survey for quite a while, actually, a few years. So response rates, the labour force survey is the major household survey that Office for National Statistics conducts on an ongoing basis, and results are produced quarterly. It has been done principally by knocking on doors, a random sample of doors, with a field force going out and collecting data. Of course, when lockdown came along, the survey switched to online data collection and some telephone, I believe, and the response rate collapsed from around 50%, I think. It's now fallen to 14.7%.
Did you say 14, 1 4 or 14?
Yeah, 14. Yeah, 1 4. So, I mean, that the figures are, of course, factored up to national totals using weights. So the national total, the lower response rate can be corrected for in terms of getting accurate counts at national level. But of course, there are response biases. So certain groups are less likely to respond than others. And that response bias problem becomes more acute the lower the response rate is. So migrant workers, renters, people in houses in multiple occupation are more difficult to get hold of and are less likely to respond for a whole bunch of reasons. Now, the weighting that's applied to factor up to national totals does go quite a long way to correcting for those response biases, but it's just been getting more and more difficult to do it accurately as the response rate has gone down and down. So this has been a known problem for some time, and since the beginning of last year, 2022, the count of total jobs from the labour force survey started to be lower than what we were getting from tax records from HMRC, and the unemployment rate was becoming lower compared to what we might expect from the claimant count, people on benefits for reason of unemployment. That problem, so we've known about this problem of the labour force survey undercounting some groups, and since last year actually undercounting the total amount of employment in the labour market, which is a major problem for managing the macroeconomy. So this problem became much more acute over the summer this year, and it reached the point 2 weeks ago when ONS were due to release their monthly update. They delayed that release by a week. It was released last week instead, a week late, and they had to adjust the headline national figures for economic activity and unemployment. First time they've ever done that, I believe, deviated from just using the labour force survey. And I think they did that quite well. They did it by using a baseline point in time from earlier this year from the labour force survey, and then they extrapolated trends from that point using administrative data sources on the number of jobs and levels of employment from HMRC tax records and from claimant count for numbers of unemployed, and the residual that they imputed for the inactive was what's left from the population total. So they did a good job of patching up and adjusting the data. So I think the data that at national level that were released last week are still reasonable for Bank of England and others to use. The other thing that Office for National Statistics have been doing, they've been developing and improving how to collect labour market data using telephone and online by simplifying the questions so that the design, they had to, obviously with the lockdown, they had to shift to online telephone data collection overnight, almost literally. So since then they've been piloting and trialing new questions and new routings and improving the design of the online survey. And that's been going on in parallel to the door knocking. So they are now they're going to release the new, what they're calling transformed labour force survey next year. And it is getting much higher response rates. And the reason for that is A, the better online design, and B, they're targeting some geographical areas with low response rates with a field force to go and knock on doors and help people, encourage people to fill in online or collect a telephone number if they don't have a telephone number, to give people the option of doing it over the phone. So ONS are doing a good job, but they're not quite there yet. So I suppose at the moment we're in the worst possible point in terms of the quality of data, but things will improve.
Thank you. That's good. Nicola, did you want to say something about the data? Because I'd like to move on to health next.
Well, just very briefly, just to give an illustration of why it's so important, because this is a survey that allows us to understand, what's happening to young people's unemployment rates, for example, relative to older people's unemployment rates. So do we need to make the case as a TUC for a particular labour market intervention to prevent young people who we know, if they experience unemployment early in their careers, will go on to experience scarring effects for decades to come? Or it allows us to look at some of the recent data show, for example, quite concerning falls in private sector employment, and increases in sectors of the economy that look like they are dominated by more public sector activities, we need to know if that's the case. Is it the case that where we've got very high vacancies in health, we're still seeing growth in employment, or is it a data error that's producing that sort of trend? So it's when we look at what's happening with real wages, are labour market pressures actually leading to wages going up? Or, as we suspect, in low wage sectors, has there been actually relatively limited impact on pay despite these very high vacancy rates in some sectors? And is another intervention needed that will incentivise employers to redistribute more of their income to supporting improved terms and conditions for their lower wage staff? So it just really, really matters. This is the best data set we have for helping us shape as a trade union movement, understand what's happening in the jobs market, how people at work are experiencing their jobs, and where there's need for more activity and action to continue to improve working life across the UK. So I can't extol the virtues of the Labour Force Survey enough, or make the case for how important it is that we get this data set, right.
Thank you. Can we move on now to some of the questions that are coming in? And one of the questions that arises, and we've heard a lot about, is the effect of COVID and on the labour market, whether long COVID has led to more people leaving the labour market. Paul, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, okay. I'd just echo Nicola's point, actually, that one of the big benefits of the LFS is the ability to do that sort of granular analysis that's not about the big headline indicators, but it's about understanding kind of what's going on under the bonnet in the labour market. So on ill health. So in the period during and since the pandemic, we saw some increase in economic inactivity. So some of that was associated with categories such as students who weren't working and people who reported they were looking after the home. And those things seem like they might be kind of blips in the data. So they've gone up and then they've gone down again relatively quickly. The one that's gone up in a more consistent way is people who are inactive due to ill health, and that's true whether you measure it in terms of people who are sort of self-identifying as ill health is the main reason for inactivity, or if you look at economic inactivity rates and look at the number of people who are reporting a disability within that sort of broader category. So it's true on both those counts. So it's a kind of it's a real phenomenon. So it's concentrated in the older cohort within the labour market, which is kind of what we'd expect. I think one of the interesting things is that it's a phenomenon that was increasing gradually before the pandemic, but sped up during the pandemic. So I think a couple of things to say about kind of what's been going on there. I mean, there are different explanations for why there are more people who are inactive due to ill health, and part of it seems to be demographic. So essentially, within that age group, there are more older people. So it's a bit skewed. So part of it seems to be explained by that. And then other issues related to more ill health generally, which is kind of consistent with the longer run. The longer run sort of trend upwards. Hospital waiting lists has been one explanation, and long COVID, which is another. And I'll let Donald deal with the long COVID because he's published some very interesting work on that. But I think when you look at that rise, it's relatively modest by kind of historic standards. So if you look at previous recessions, there's tended to be a comparatively bigger increase in economic inactivity. But the reason it's important is because when it goes up, it tends to go up sort of relatively quickly. So it ticks up like the Nike symbol, but actually then it comes down incredibly slowly, and often most of the reason it comes down actually is just to do with changes in the cohort. So over 10 years, it's a completely different set of people within that age band. So that's why it's a problem, not necessarily that it's gone up enormously, but because when it goes up, it doesn't tend to come back down again, at least for the same cohort of people who have exited. who have exited the labour market. And I think, I mean, part of it speaks to much longer term issues. I think with the sort of statutory sick pay system, for example, in the UK, and this very kind of leaky bucket system that we've got to ill health in the workplace. I think the other interesting thing is when you look at kind of household economic positions of what's driven some of those changes in economic inactivity, a good deal of it seems to be concentrated in owner occupiers who own their house outright, and the big change has been between dual earners in owned properties, and where there's a single earner within those households. So so there's some interaction there clearly also with economic position, in terms of in terms of whether people have a mortgage or whether they own their houses kind of outright. But it's and there's lots of comorbidity within there as well. When you look at what people are describing as their main conditions, there's also a whole range of kind of secondary conditions. So I think it's something that's worrying from a kind of labour market perspective, but equally, if we're becoming less healthy over time, that's a kind of worry in itself.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Donald, long COVID.
Yeah, the question was specifically about long COVID. I and some others have looked specifically at long COVID, we can't identify long COVID from the labour force survey, but we can from another data set called Understanding Society, which is funded by the government's Economic Social Research Council. It put in a module about COVID during the pandemic, so people were asked to self-report long COVID, defined as a condition that had lasted more than 12 weeks and couldn't be explained by anything else following a COVID infection. So it's reasonably reliable as self-reported health data go. We used that survey, which is longitudinal, it follows the same people over time, to see how many people fell out of employment after the onset of long COVID, in conjunction with the ONS's COVID infection survey, which had overall infection rates and self-reported long COVID. Anyway, long story. The bottom line is that we estimated that by the March 2022, by that point, 80,000 people had left employment because of long COVID. Some of them will, since then, some of them will have recovered and gone back to work, or gone back into the workforce. But offsetting that, more people will have developed long COVID. So long COVID is, it's not by any means, it's not the whole story in terms of the shrinking workforce, which shrunk by about 500,000, but it's a reasonable chunk of it. And by its nature, long COVID is something that is likely to affect someone for some time. There is quite a chunk of people who have had COVID, long COVID, for more than a year or two, and even since the beginning of the pandemic. So long COVID is one of these post-viral syndromes that's difficult to diagnose. It doesn't always show up in medical records. You might, because it can have a range of symptoms. It can be fatigue, it can be inflammation in most parts of the body, it can be high blood pressure, it can manifest as different things. So there does seem to be quite a lot of that, and that is part of the story. So it's important that we have a good national programme to help with long COVID and help with rehabilitation. I think we've still got a way to go with that. In terms of health more generally, just picking up some of the things that Paul said, and also Nicola, in relation to the importance of having good data to be able to identify issues. Quite a long time ago, a project that I worked on looking at people on incapacity benefit, as it was called then, now employment support allowance. or now that's rolled into universal credit, of course, but it still sort of exists within the universal credit system. We looked at data going right back to 1980, looking at the proportion of people with long-lasting health conditions who were in employment compared to people who were not in employment. And until about 1980, the employment rate of people with disabilities and long-term health conditions wasn't actually that much lower than the overall employment rate. I think it was about 70% were employed. By the early noughties, or by 2000, that employment rate of people with poor health had fallen to about 40% or less. So the employment rate of people with health problems and disabilities has collapsed since the latter part of the 20th century. And that is linked to the issues we talked about at the beginning about precarity and very competitive labour markets and workplaces and so on. I mean, we've had Disability Discrimination Act, which is rolled into the Equalities Act, which covers a range of protected characteristics, which I think has played a role in arresting that decline in employment rates. And I think they actually edged up slightly, but nowhere near back to the point that they were in the 1970s.
Thank you. That it leads me very neatly into asking Nicola, what does the TUC think about people with long-term health issues, whether it's long COVID or otherwise? And also, perhaps you could answer the question that has on the slide: could benefit changes boost labour market participation?
Thanks, Catherine. I think that the point is really important to remember. It's very interesting listening to Paul and Donald and the work that you've done on this. But for our contribution to the conversation, we've done a little bit of analysis that looked at risk of economic inactivity because of ill health by occupation. And it's quite salient because it reminded me that I'm sure this has always been the case, but in our analysis, it was undertaken earlier this year, the huge difference there is in terms of that your chance of being economically inactive because of ill health is so much higher if you're in a low paid job, the sorts of job that's classified by the ONS as an elementary occupation, caring and leisure, sales or customer service, compared to being economically inactive because of ill health if you're in a professional job. So, most people who are out of work in their late 50s and 60s from professional backgrounds are out of work because they have retired, and the inverse is true for people in lower wage occupations. So I think it's important to keep that point in mind. And obviously the people in those positions, in those lower paid occupations, are also less likely to have built up occupational pensions. We still don't have auto enrolment for people who are earning less than £10,000 a year, for example. So you're going to find a whole cohort of people in that group who will be out of work and reliant on out of work benefits if they are able to receive them for a lot of their income, whereas you have a sort of wealthier group of people who might have been able to retire or have taken retirement, who could probably also be more likely to rely on a workplace pension as well for that period of time. So I think that the extent to which those inequalities have always been there is important to remember, but they've also been exacerbated, I think, over time, and again over the course of the pandemic. What do we think needs to happen? I mean, it's been the TUC has been for a long time and is very concerned about the lack of generosity of our overall social security system. It's one of the least generous across Europe. It provides very little support for people who are out of work, and the conditionality around it is extremely tight. And some of the most recent increases we've seen over recent years in sanctions. It just serve to remove entitlements from people who need them, and show themselves up in those awful statistics we saw from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation last week about the level of destitution we have across this country at the moment. So we have long called for a more generous benefit system that provides people with support and training to get back into work, and recognises that for very many people who are out of work, whether that's because of ill health or whether it's because of unemployment, if you offer them a good job with prospects and the opportunity for training and the health and care they need, it would be an enormous relief. And it's the lack of services and support and opportunities to move into real jobs that offer real opportunities of paid employment that are holding people back, rather than a lack of commitment. But I think that in terms of benefit rules and labour market participation, there has been some interesting work done on this recently. I can't remember where I was, but I've heard some think tank, I wish I could credit them, has done an interesting analysis of the role that a fairer social security system could play in enhancing labour market participation. And intuitively, I'm sure it's right. When you look at flexicurity regimes across other parts of Europe, the presumption is that you allow better job matching, you allow people a bit more time and space if they lose their job to find one that allows them to make best use of their skills. You don't force people into a position where they've literally got to take the first job that comes across so that they continue to pay their bills. And it should lead to better opportunities for people to apply their skills in the most productive way, and reduced incentives on employers to create lots and lots of extremely insecure bad jobs. So I'm sure there is evidence that's the case, and I know that in other systems in parts of Europe that will be the model that they have, which often goes alongside a stronger contributory element to social security, and a stronger set of in-work support programs to enable people to sort of sustain their employment when they move back into it.
Thank you. Those answers are really interesting. Quite a lot of good questions have come in, and what I was going to do is just ask the question, and if you could just raise your hand if you're particularly would like to respond to this, so we can get through as many questions as possible rather than asking everyone to respond to each question. One of the questions is how much of the recent insolvencies and unemployment rises can be attributed to pre-pandemic zombie firms who were propped up, finally now going under? Go on, Paul.
This is not my space, but I mean, I'd say anecdotally quite a lot, but in terms of robustly evidencing that, I think it's unclear.
Thank you. Nicola?
Then this would be based on anecdote, but I think it's as much a combination of the poor growth that we've seen and the very high inflation and high interest rate environment that we're in, rather than the fundamental performance of these firms, because there's the wider issue is that we've got this depressed demand. I'm not sure it is the state of the individual businesses that's the problem. It's the lack of demand to enable them to grow, right? If you're in a sort of stagnating recessionary environment, it's going to be hard for a lot of businesses to keep going.
Thank you. Has the post-Brexit immigration system led to shortages in the labour market? With UK and a change of Europe, we always come back to Brexit. Go on, Barnard.
The short answer is yes. I mean, on the basis that compared to when we were in the EU, there's a lot less people are able to migrate for work to the UK from the EU. That is, however, offset by the fact that the new immigration system makes it easier for people from outside the EU to come here. But the overall net migration figures do imply that since the referendum, more than Brexit itself, certainly EU net migration which was growing, it was positive, it became zero effectively. But we saw a big uptick in migration from outside the EU. Quite a lot of that was students, however. So it's a smaller effect than COVID, that's for sure, in contributing to labour supply shortages and poor health. But it's probably a more long-lasting one because it's going to stay like this.
Nicola, did you want to add to that?
Just to add to it, to say that another concern we have is that the structure of some of the visas that people are now coming in on is driving wider concerns about the jobs market, because if you've got somebody coming in on a 6-month visa, for example, the seasonal worker visas that you see at the moment, incapable really within that 6 months of leaving and finding another job before their visa ends, if they're subject to very exploitative treatment in the jobs market, it drives a system where you've taken further power away from workers, and many people feel as if they have just no choice but to put up with terms and conditions which are unacceptable, in some cases illegal. So we have a wider concern, as well as the impact that the Brexit deal has had on levels of investment and on the operation of our jobs market and our economy more widely, about the sort of this new type of immigration, which is tied to much stricter visas and reduces workers' scope for moving jobs or for joining unions or for organising to prevent labour market exploitation.
A related question to that, I will paraphrase the question, but is essentially, Donald, you mentioned the dramatic increase in number of visas going to non-EU nationals. The question is the UK government giving visas quietly, avoiding scrutiny from its voter base?
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't really have any evidence on which to base an answer, but my understanding and direct experience of the visa system working in a university, at least, is I'm not sure it would be hidden as such. I'm not quite sure how that would necessarily happen.
I think certainly we would say that, the visa costs are absolutely dramatic. And so, and they've just gone up recently by a significant margin. And of course, the paperwork that goes with them is significant. But maybe what the question is referring to is the fact that although we talk about high-skilled visas or high-skilled workers, the fact is you only need to have the equivalent of A-level qualification to be considered for a visa, assuming that the occupation you want to work for is on the relevant list. And so, but then of course there is the significant visa cost and the immigration health surcharge, which has also gone up significantly. So I think it's unlikely that the UK government is giving visas quietly, because the costs are so significant and there is a very formal process. But it's certainly the case that significant numbers of non-EU nationals are coming to the UK. It's about 700,000 last year. Just moving through the questions, I realise we haven't got much time. What are the future and persistent challenges with the labour market that we don't understand well enough? I think obviously you've raised some of them, about even the data collection is a problem. What should we be focusing future research on? This is obviously someone who's looking for a good PhD title. Go on, Paul.
I mean, there are well-known long-term issues around productivity, around linking productivity to wages. So it's not necessarily things that aren't understood. I think it's about finding the workable solutions to those things. And just, I mean, one other thing I'd point to is the continuing decline of training in the workplace. And that, and that's been declining for a long time. And I think that's, when we talk about low pay and insecure jobs, and I think, part of it also is about what feels like an employer aversion, or some employers' aversion to training their workforce, which ultimately should have productivity and hopefully wage benefits as well.
Thank you. There's a question. Oh, sorry, Nicola, I'll ask you to answer that. And also, there's another interesting question, which I imagine the TUC has done some work on. How big a factor in inhibiting labour market participation are childcare costs?
Okay, thanks. Well, if I just go back to the research question, because absolute plea from me if people are interested. We've got this huge body of research now in the UK about the minimum wage and its effects on employment. And I would love to see some more research on the effects of wider employment terms and conditions, both on productivity and on employment, because I think we've had this long period in the 90s where we sort of talked about the benefits of the UK's flexible labour market, and there was a sort of presentation of the UK's jobs market as sort of flexible relative to the rest of Europe, and that being where many of our strengths come from, to a position where now we've seen the minimum wage rise, as I was saying earlier, in sort of very rapidly relative to what many people might have thought would be possible without seeing negative effects on employment. And we have also seen a shift in terms of wider economic evidence of the role of regulation in driving up productivity and improving economic performance. So you've got the OECD, for example, speaking about the economic benefits of sectoral collective bargaining. So I would love to see more of an evidence base about the productivity gains and the gains that could be brought to employers from improving security, and whether that's in terms of recruitment or retention or reducing turnover or improved productivity, as well as the evidence base that speaks to the gains that minimum wages have brought in that regard. I think you asked a separate question, Catherine. Sorry, I can't remember what it was.
About childcare. Has childcare inhibited labour market, or the cost of childcare?
I think it's the cost of childcare, but I think it's also the availability. And I think for very many women, particularly in lower wage occupations, it's a question of whether you can return to work at all. Because if you have got primary childcare responsibility for young children and there simply isn't any childcare available, or what's available will only be paid at a rate that doesn't cover the hours that you will need to do your job, and your job doesn't allow you the flexibility to, have the time off when your nursery is closed or your kid is sick, or on the weeks of the year where your free childcare isn't available, that's actually an issue of as much and of greater concern as the overall costs of childcare. Because I think when you look at who's using childcare, you have to be able to afford to have childcare in the first place, and you have to have availability of childcare near your job to be in the position of then to even start to encounter childcare costs as a barrier. I don't want to underestimate it. I know how much childcare costs are, and I'm sure that for very many, and I know for very many people, I'm not sure we've done any particular new research on it beyond what's already published, but the very high costs of childcare in parts of the country will no doubt be preventing people from increasing their hours, or from being able to move jobs if they can't find a job that would fit with their current childcare offer. So I think there's a much bigger question, though, about the availability of care and the way that care commitments fit with paid work, and the ability of jobs and employers to recognise that people have both paid and unpaid commitments that need to be balanced in their lives at different times. That creates all sorts of barriers to employment and progression, and to improving our productivity potential.
Thank you. I have one last question, which rolls up two questions in one, and I'm afraid I can only allow you a sort of brief yes/no answer. Should students bother to be going to university when the real increase in work is for low-skilled employment? Donald?
Yes, they should keep going to university. That's where the long-term demand for skills and productivity lies.
I mean, it's a bit like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas, given I'm asking this of academics, but Paul?
Yes, they should. What I think is that we need some sort of the demand side policy around the types of jobs that we're creating to go along with this sort of supply push. So yes, is the one word answer.
Thank you, Nicola.
Yes, absolutely. And they should also push for a government that's committed to ensuring we have the sorts of economic and industrial policy that will grow the demand for graduate labour and ensure that that's spread equally across the country.
Perfect. Well, that's a good way to end. It keeps us, at least the three of us who work in universities, in jobs. So unsurprisingly, we're in favour of that. We don't want to add to the unemployment figures. I want to thank you all very warmly for your contributions to those on the panel, but also to you who've been listening and kindly suggesting such thought-provoking and interesting questions. Can I just remind you that if you've enjoyed today, please head to our website, UK and a Changing Europe. Loads of new events coming up. Most Tuesdays we have a lunchtime event, and there's none. Our next Unlocked event is with Andrea Leadsom, and we also have a full range of events on E3, and there's an interesting event on the Brexit related research. You'll see all of the many activities that we're engaged there. Please join us as many as you can, and thank you once again to our panel, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.